Welcome back, friends. This is Amanda with a Happy Homestead, and today I'm going to do an update on my MockMill. I have had my MockMill for I think close to 2.5 years now, and I did a video on it a long time ago when I first started putting some videos on YouTube, and so you can go find that, check that one out, or you can just stay here because this one is going to be an update on how I still use it, what do I think of it, am I glad I purchased it, all about the MockMill today. Some of you are wondering, what is a MockMill? Well, this is it. This is basically an in-home personal grinder to grind all of your grains for freshly ground flour. So I put everything in here, it spits out here, and there are some adjustments here as far as like how fine it needs to be depending upon the type of grain you are using. The off-on switch, and that's it. It's so user-friendly and so simple. So while I still buy all-purpose flour, and I also buy einkorn all-purpose flour, that is the only flour that has been ground commercially elsewhere that comes into our home. I don't buy any other pre-ground flour. For the last 2.5 years, I've been doing it on demand for Here Huz at Home. So what that means is I have to buy the grain fully intact, and I do that from Azure Standard. And let me show you all of the grains that we have. So these are all of the grains that I have in my house and that I've been using over the last 2.5 years. We'll start from left to right. This is soft white wheat, and you can see as I go through each one, this one has a much lighter and a bigger grain. And so I use soft white wheat for cakes. It's kind of what it says, right? It's a softer, lighter, fluffier wheat when it's ground. So I use it for cakes, maybe for muffins, and also for rolls, like dinner rolls. Then there is hard red wheat. And I'll just do this with the same. This is hard white wheat. So while the grains do look a little different, this one's a tiny bit smaller, you can definitely tell the color difference, right? So hard white, hard red. These are pretty interchangeable in my book. I use them both very often, and these are strictly for my sourdough loaves. So a hard wheat is something that you'd want to use that has structure, right? You want your loaf to have structure. You don't want it to fall flat. So hard red and hard white are my go-tos for homemade sourdough bread. Spelt is also similar to a soft white wheat. It doesn't have as much structure, much gluten, as the hard red or the hard white. So I use this kind of interchangeably sometimes as my soft white wheat. I will sometimes mix this into my bread doughs. It's just a different type of wheat. It's actually an ancient grain, and it creates a really great flavor as well. And then we move over to einkorn. Einkorn is also an ancient grain, and it's pretty versatile. It can be used in almost any of the other uses as well. But the difference with einkorn is that it needs a lot less water, hydration is what it would be called, right, compared to some of the other grains. So it's sometimes a little bit of a learning curve when you work with freshly ground einkorn. So these are the 5 grains that we always have on hand in our home. There are others available. Azure has a couple of other ancient grains that you can purchase, but I find that just these 5 work perfectly well for all of the uses that I would need the flour for. And honestly, I don't really want to store any more flour or any more grains at this point. Now, I'm going to go through a couple of the questions I've received over the last 2.5 years. So, number 1, what are these jars? I get a lot of questions on that. These are Ball, I think it's the Centennial jar, but they are gallon size jars. I love them. But yeah, they have like the Ball label on them here on the back, and these are just kind of like airtight lids. There we go. So it has like a rubber seal, and then it's just the lid. But I do love these jars, and so they are the gallon size. I got them, you're not gonna believe this, but I got them at Target. I bought a few more since I originally bought those, so I know that they still have them, but at Target is where I purchased them. Second question is do I like my MockMill and would I buy it again? Yes, I actually really love it. It does take a little step, an extra step or 2 steps, right? When you're ready to do something with flour, because you got to grind it, measure it out, and then you have it. But I would absolutely buy it again if that situation came up, right? I have no desire to get rid of my MockMill. I really do love it. A third question I often get is really, what is the difference between what I'm doing here with grinding the entire wheat grain versus an all-purpose or even a 9-corn all-purpose flour? And the answer from that is really just so simply, it comes down to the nutritional value. So when you're buying and using an all-purpose flour, it is just the endosperm of that wheat grain. So all of the other good stuff, the bran and the actual germ and the covering, the brown covering of that kernel is removed. And that is where a lot of the nutrients, the vitamins, and the fiber are, right? And so when you get an all-purpose flour, it's that gorgeous white fluffy flour, and that's just the endosperm. And when I'm grinding on demand here, I'm getting the entire nutritional value of that wheat grain. And so for that alone is the reason I would never go back to just all-purpose. Another question I get is about shelf life, right? If I'm grinding on demand, wouldn't it be easier for me to grind a whole lot of one particular grain, store it in a container, and then have it ready to go and make my life easier? Theoretically, yes. However, this is something you also need to kind of be aware of and maybe change your habits and how you plan to do things if you are going to have your own home flour grinder or grain grinder. And the reason is because all-purpose flour has a shelf life of 7 to 8 months, depending upon how you store it, if you're storing it properly. So you never want to buy, and this goes for just about any flour, but you never want to buy an already ground flour in such a large volume that you don't go through it that fast. So you want to make sure that if you are not going through it that fast, store it in the freezer. I actually store all of my all-purpose flour and einkorn all-purpose flour that is my back stock in our freezer. And then I do have a ball gallon container in our pantry that I go through. And then as that goes down in volume, I will bring some out of the freezer. But you want to store your already ground flour in the freezer, with the exception of what you're going to keep in your pantry. Now, with whole ground flour, which is what I'm doing, that shelf life goes down immensely, right? Because remember, we are keeping the entire nutritional value, the entire grain kernel intact, just ground, right? We're not removing anything like you do with an all-purpose. And so it does go rancid, and it can go rancid a lot faster. So I do not have any pre-ground flour in our house, with the exception of the 2 all-purpose flours that we keep in our freezer. Now, if I am planning on making something of a large volume, maybe I'm making 4 sourdough loaves to give to some people, I will grind all of that flour, but maybe I'm not making it for the next day or 2. I'll keep it in the refrigerator. So there are times where I can grind in advance just a few days and I'll keep it in the fridge. If you really wanted to grind in advance a lot at a time, then I would recommend storing it in the freezer. Okay, another question are the little weevils, those little grain weevils. Have you ever had that happen? I have. And it is the most disgusting and unnerving experience. I think it's happened to me twice. And so what happens is there's these little weevils, little grain weevils, little bugs that can get into the kernel. It happens all over. It is not going to be particular to a certain part of the world or part of the country. It just happens. It's not even particular necessarily to the type of grain. It can happen in any grain. But it happens once that grain is ground, the eggs hatch, and then you get bugs in your ground flour. So the bug isn't alive in the grain. It's like they lay their eggs in it, and then when the grain is ground up, right, then the eggs hatch. And so this has only ever happened to me with all-purpose flour that I have purchased from the store, and this was years ago. And I just remember Oh, it is like literally the most unnerving and disgusting experience, and you just throw everything away. It's just like these little bugs. And so when I had my all-purpose flour in one of these jars, you could see these little bugs moving around in here. Oh, now that's not for me to say don't go buy flour in the store, because that is totally unreasonable. What I say is, like, when you buy pre-ground flour, store it in the freezer. It actually kills all those eggs, and then you don't have that problem ever. So I always store pre-ground flour in the freezer, no matter where I've purchased it, and then I grind on demand for everything else. Okay, I think that covers a lot of the topics that are important for you to know. Let's start grinding some soft white wheat. Okay, so one more thing I do want to note is that with fresh ground flour, I try to choose recipes where the volume is in weight and not by measurement, right? So for instance, if I am making my hamburger buns, instead of it saying I need 2 cups of flour, it'll say I need, and I'm just throwing a number out here, right? But 300 grams flour. So I always try to do weight. This is also just a behavioral change I've had to get used to, but it's really not a big deal. I'll touch more on that in a little bit, but let's start grinding. So I'm going to grind everything, and it comes down here, and then I'll just kind of weigh it on my scale within this bowl. One more thing I wanted to tell you is that before you ever grind your own grains, and this is probably ubiquitous between the different models and manufacturers, is you always want to turn it on first before you put grains in the hopper. There is a stone wheel in here, and it's basically using the stone wheel to grind up the grains. And if you put your grains in first, it will get stuck, and the machine won't work. And this happened to me when I first started using this. So I always turn it on first, then pour the grains in. And I'll just do that tap at the end there to make sure any loose flour comes out. So I've got my 400 grams measured out. Now I do have some flour left over here, which is typical. I don't always measure out, or rather I don't always grind out the exact measurement of what I need. And so in this case, I will just put this in a container and I'll put it in the fridge. And I'll just make sure I use it this week, right? If I'm not gonna use it anytime soon, I'd put it in the freezer, but I always just put it in the fridge and just make sure it gets used. So let me touch on something that I was mentioning before I started grinding, and that is using your measurement of weight over volume. And so I find that using a recipe that can give you the weight and or the volume really helps. And I will link down the hamburger bun recipe I use. It's from a website called Seasons and Suppers. And this is just one that I have found I really like. It's worked well. My family loves it. But what I also love about it is that when you go onto the website and you get to the recipe and you hit print me, it'll give you the option for imperial or metric. Now, imperial is what we use in the United States, and that is the volume, right? 2 cups, 3 cups, 2 teaspoons, a tablespoon, that's volume. But if you click on the metric part, it'll go over to and give you weights, usually in grams. And so I printed it out in imperial, but then I made my little side note here of the flour in grams. And so I knew I needed 400 grams of flour. So just a little tidbit, right? If you start grinding your own grains at home, you're gonna notice that not everything is equal comparatively to an all-purpose flour. So just be aware of that and try to find recipes with weight, or even experiment and weigh it out yourself and kind of come up with a number. I used to have like a number of between 115 grams to 125 grams equaled 1 cup of flour, but even that's not always the case. So just another behavioral change you'll get used to. I promise you it's worth it. I guess the last thing I'd like to share is that you can use your MockMill for so many things. You can actually grind rice to get a rice flour. You can do corn kernels to get your cornmeal. I have not done the cornmeal, but I have done the rice because I use the rice flour sometimes to line my banneton for my sourdough because it doesn't have gluten, so it won't bind with the dough. So I have done rice successfully, but I haven't done any other grains. There are so many more things that you can do with it. I just haven't done it yet. You can also do oats for an oat flour too. So all in all, I still love my MockMill 2.5 years later. I have no regrets. I have had no problems. The only issue I had was self-induced, and that is when I put my grains in it before I turned the machine on. And this was 2 years ago, and I haven't done it since. I learned my lesson and I learned it fast. But it is a quality machine. Highly recommend it. I wish I had some sort of discount code to give you, but I don't. But I really want to do this update because I have received so much feedback and questions in regards to this. Hope it was helpful for you. Thanks for joining me in the kitchen today. I gotta go get this hamburger dough made for dinner tonight. Stay healthy, stay well. Bye-bye.